There is a fundamental misunderstanding of risk that pervades our civilization. It is taught to us from childhood, reinforced by corporate culture and calcified by bureaucracy. We are conditioned to view risk as a negative potential outcome, a loss of money, a loss of time, a loss of reputation, or a loss of life. Therefore, the human tendency is always to minimize the immediate, visible variance, to seek stability, to optimize for the local maximum of comfort. This mindset, while seemingly rational on the surface, is perhaps the most profound systemic error we make. It is an intellectual trap, because by solely focusing on the risk of action, we deliberately ignore the far more insidious, dangerous, and often fatal risk of inaction. To innovate, to truly build a future worth having, you must learn to see past the immediate potential disaster. You must develop the rigor to calculate the long-term, compounding cost of stagnation. You must learn to fear not the explosion in the test stand, but the quiet, slow death of a species that stopped reaching. The universe operates on an asymmetric equation. If you are pursuing an incremental goal, a 10% improvement, a slightly better quarterly profit, the reward is linear. It is predictable, and the associated risk must also be minimized to maintain that linearity. This is the path of incremental optimization. It's safe, but it's a terminal curve. It eventually plateaus. But if you are pursuing an order of magnitude improvement, a 10x goal, the reward is non-linear. It's exponential. Achieving a 10x result doesn't just make you better, it changes the rules of the game entirely. It moves you from competing on marginal efficiency to creating an entirely new domain of possibility. When the potential reward is non-linear, when the success of the mission has an existential magnitude, the calculation of risk must fundamentally change. Consider the early days of reusable rocketry. The risk of the first few landing attempts was statistically enormous. The vehicle could crash, it could explode, billions of dollars of hardware could be lost, and years of effort destroyed. The traditional corporate view would mandate minimizing that probability to near zero. But the systems thinker asks, what is the reward? The reward is not just a successful landing. The reward is cutting the fundamental cost of access to space by a factor of 100. The reward is opening the door to a multiplanetary future. When a small, measurable failure prevents an existential, guaranteed doom, remaining a single-planet species, the perceived risk of the action is irrelevant compared to the certainty of the inaction. You must be willing to accept the immediate, visible risk for the sake of the distant, overwhelming reward. We must eliminate the cultural and linguistic baggage around the word failure. A failure is only a failure if the process terminates and no learning is extracted. That is a linear event. In an iterative systemic process, which is the only way true innovation happens, what the public calls a failure is merely a rapid, expensive, and necessary feedback loop. It is a data point. It is a tuition payment to the laws of physics. If a rocket explodes, the question is not who is to blame. That is an organizational, non-systemic question. The question is, what did the hardware or the software tell us about the physics that we did not already know? The purpose of the early tests is not to succeed. The purpose of the early tests is to fail as quickly and as cheaply as possible to find the unknown unknowns, the flaws in the structure, the blind spots in the model. This is the only path to a structurally correct solution. If your process is engineered for zero failure, it is engineered for zero learning. You are merely proving things you already know, which means your timeline to true innovation stretches out indefinitely. Therefore, the risk tolerance of the system, of the engineering team, of the company, must be deliberately designed to be higher than the competition. Your acceptance of immediate, visible risk is your competitive advantage in the long-term knowledge acquisition race. The linear thinker seeks certainty. They demand a 99.9% probability of success before proceeding. This need for certainty is paralyzing. In the domains of extreme innovation, the nonlinear 10x domains, certainty is an illusion. By definition, if you knew the solution with high certainty, it would not be a breakthrough. It would be an incremental optimization of an existing system. Therefore, the innovator must embrace bounded uncertainty. You must rigorously prove that the goal does not violate the laws of physics. That is the minimum threshold. If the goal is physically possible, if the atoms and molecules allow it, then the uncertainty lies purely in the engineering execution and the time horizon. The risk assessment shifts from, what is the probability of success, to what is the required investment of time and capital to reduce the probability of failure to an acceptable level, given the existential reward. This is the key mental reframe. The calculation is not about mitigating risk. It is about paying the necessary iteration cost. If you wait for external certainty, the opportunity will pass, or someone else will solve the problem. The risk you take is not in the launch, but in the commitment to the mission when everyone else views the mission as absurd. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, the cost of stagnation. Stagnation is not merely standing still. It is a systemic decay. In a dynamic universe, if you are not actively growing and iterating, you are contracting. For a civilization, stagnation on a single planet means guaranteed extinction, an inevitable statistically certain event, a supervolcano, an asteroid, a self-inflicted pandemic, will eventually terminate the species. The single-planet civilization is a single point of failure. Resource limitation. Dependence on finite resources on one sphere ensures systemic collapse through conflict, famine, or environmental degradation. The resources are limited. The desire is infinite. This is a reinforcing negative feedback loop. Loss of purpose, the cultural cost. If the species loses its frontier, its grand challenge, its teleology, it turns inward. Energy is spent on internal conflict and maintaining status quo rather than creation. This cost is cumulative and exponential. Every year we delay becoming a multiplanetary species. The cost of that delay, when measured in increased probability of extinction, grows larger. The perceived risk of launching 100 rockets, losing some, spending vast capital, is infinitesimally small compared to the absolute certainty of failure inherent in remaining on a fragile, small planet forever. You must stop managing for the quarterly report and start managing for the existential timeline. Why do powerful, large organizations so consistently fail to take the right level of risk? Because they are structurally designed to penalize the individual who takes the necessary action and reward the individual who seeks cover. If an engineer proposes a radical 10x solution that fails early, that engineer will face career repercussions. If an engineer proposes an incremental, safe 1.1x solution that succeeds predictably, that engineer is rewarded. The system is engineered to optimize for personal safety over mission success. To change this, you must change the structural loops within the organization. Decouple failure from identity. A failure in the hardware must not be equated with a failure of the person. Failure must be treated as data generated by the system. Reward the right question. Reward the engineer who asks the difficult, first principles question that challenges the entire design, even if the question initially sounds absurd or disruptive. Minimize sign-offs, reduce the liability shield. When 10 people have to sign off on a decision, 10 people share the risk, which means 0 people own the outcome. The decision maker must have autonomy and must be held accountable for the mission result, not for avoiding paperwork. The goal is to engineer a culture where the fear of missing the mission objective is greater than the fear of losing hardware. Now, apply this philosophy to your own life. Most people approach career, relationships, and finance with a risk-averse portfolio designed to minimize the downside. This is fine for incremental living, but it is incompatible with a life of creation or profound impact. If your life's purpose is not aligned with an existential objective, if you are simply optimizing for a comfortable existence, then the necessary, aggressive risks will feel like true threats. You will lack the necessary conviction. But if you identify your personal, grand challenge, if you align your entire being with a mission that transcends your own lifetime, then the calculation changes dramatically. The risk of pursuing the mission, losing money, social standing, time, becomes secondary to the spiritual and psychological cost of not pursuing it. The real risk is looking back and knowing you sacrificed your greatest potential for the illusion of safety. The existential alignment provides the fuel for persistence through the inevitable failure loops. You keep pushing, not because you are stubborn, but because the alternative is fundamentally unacceptable to the core mission. We are a product of a 4 billion-year-old evolutionary process that's selected for complexity and resilience. We have been granted, through sheer luck and physics, the temporary ability to determine our own future. Risk is simply the price of progress. It is the currency of the future. Do not be paralyzed by the fear of the spectacular crash that makes the headlines. That is just noise. Instead, calculate the true, terrible cost of the unchosen path, the stagnation that leads to oblivion, the quiet, gentle drift into irrelevance. If the reward is the expansion of consciousness and the extension of life into the cosmos, then every risk, every failure, every lost ship is merely a necessary step in the greatest journey our species will ever take. The clock is ticking. The risk is not in the doing. The risk is in the waiting.